Welcome and thank you for attending Hongsbook's second webinar, Working with Families, Communication Skills, and Boundary Setting. A little background info. In May of 2013, a survey was conducted of past participants and to find out their training needs. So what they told us was family issues, boundaries, and communication skills were in their top 10 choices for webinars. So, therefore, this webinar is funded by Citizenship and Immigration Canada as part of our journey to promote mental health. And, okay, I'm seeing some people are saying that they can't see me. So we're going to try to tweak this before we continue. Can you see me now? No, nobody can see me yet. Okay. We have our technical man working on this situation. Okay, so somebody is saying that you can now see and hear me. Is that correct? If so, just let me know. Yep. It's choppy and so is the sound. I'm not quite sure what we can do about that. Okay, well, I'll go slow. Okay, it's good now. All right. So once this webinar is finished, we're going to archive it, and it'll be available on our website, hongsbook.ca, in approximately 1 week. Great. Okay, so for today, we have as our speaker Dr. Patricia Pindel. She has many decades of experience in health and human services, as well as in post-secondary education, including working with young people and families. She's currently working on a book on family dynamics for Canadian Scholars Trust. At any time during the presentation, feel free to type in questions in the chat box. And for your questions, please select Send to All Panelists so the other participants can also see your question. And Dr. Pindel will answer your question pretty much immediately, as soon as possible. If you have any technical issues, like I said, type that into Send to Host. At the end of the presentation, a brief evaluation survey will pop up in a new window once you close the webinar window. So please take a few minutes to fill it out, and that'll help us improve on our webinars, because we're still kind of new at this, so we're working on getting better, and we want to hear your valuable feedback. Okay, so that's enough for an intro. Now I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Pindel, and she's going to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. It's really odd because I can't see you, and I know you can see me, but we're going to proceed here, and I'm just going to go to my PowerPoint. So I'm assuming I'm just putting that up on the screen, am I? Yes, I am. There it is. So let's just begin. And what I want to just tell you is that this webinar is divided into two sections. The first section, we're going to talk about the impacts of immigration, and we're going to talk about what happens to refugee families and some of the traumatic effects that refugee families and people who've been through war and dislocation have had to deal with, and the impact on themselves. And what that's going to actually be about is there's going to be a little bit of psychodynamic theory there, but it's not going to be the DSM-4, TR, DSM-5 kind of psychodynamic diagnoses. What you're going to hear about and what you're going to see is something that Dr. Wilson, who wrote a wonderful book called Broken Spirits, actually, and by the way, if you get a chance to read that book, please do. He did a wonderful book on that where he described the impact on a person's self when they go through terrible trauma. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but then in the second half, I'm going to talk a lot about what you as professionals can do to help families and to help individuals who are in this kind of situation. So we're going to proceed, and now I've pressed the button and it's not moving on. So we'll just take a moment and See if I can get the button to move. See, I'll try it this way. There we go. You're going to notice as I go through this that I'm not wonderful at these kinds of electronic things, but bear with me. Okay, the first thing that I want to talk about, and I'm just going to move the text box a little bit here, is that I think all of you know, if you're working with people who are immigrants or people who are refugees, that immigration happens for a variety of different reasons. There may be natural disasters that occur and people won't immigrate for those reasons. A lot of immigration to Canada is because people want to improve their economic situation, or maybe they want educational opportunities for their children. They want their children to do better than they did. In other cases, there'll be other opportunities people will be seeking, and in some cases, there's family reunification, where a family has been split for a number of years, and perhaps children stayed with grandparents and the parents moved on. And then they have to be reunified. And I think you can see just how difficult that can be for families to try to reunify after years and years apart. The important thing for you as professionals is to know the reasons why people immigrated. And a lot of professionals don't ask those questions, and they should, because out of those questions come the family story. You'll start to hear the reasons that preceded immigration. And those reasons become very important later on, as you're going to see, as you try to help families through and help them navigate some of the really difficult issues that they can confront as a result of immigration. Knowing why they immigrated and helping to integrate that into their new life is very important. We'll try this again. Okay, I'm using the buttons. All right, so all of you already know that there are some challenges that are facing immigrant families. Unemployment, at least initially, for many immigrant families is high. And in that situation, you'll see people become depressed. If they can't find a job, they're feeling that they're not fitting into Canadian society, they're not making new connections with other people in a place of work. It's very difficult sometimes for the first while until people become employed. The other problem, and it's one that is not often mentioned but should be, is underemployment. There's so often times when people who have tremendous credentials from their countries of origin, they can't find work in Canada. And so they end up doing things like driving cab or working in a restaurant, and it's extremely demeaning for them, because they have these wonderful skills that they could contribute to this country, and they're not having the opportunity to contribute them. And that can cause depression, and it can cause people to lose faith in themselves. Another big issue, of course, is discrimination. And that can lead to extreme isolation and people internalizing bad feelings about themselves. If you're discriminated against, unless you have a very strong sense of yourself, it's going to affect you. And so that's a major problem that a lot of immigrant families are facing. That and also social isolation. If they don't know anyone in their new country, and they'll tend to try to stick with any people from their old country who they come into contact with. That can be good and bad, because on the one hand, it allows them to continue to feel connected to their country of origin. But on the other hand, it can prevent them from actually integrating into their new country and becoming involved with other people and with their communities in more engaging ways so that they feel more a part of their new country. And that can lead to a type of social isolation as well, if they just remain in their own communities where they feel comfortable. There can be concerns about children when they lose their cultural heritage, or they feel that they're losing their cultural heritage. In some ways they may not be, but they may appear to be, because they're dressing differently, they're talking differently, they're behaving in ways that the families don't feel comfortable with. And so that can be extremely difficult for both children and for parents, because it can cause a lot of conflict between the two. And in fact, a lot of the conflicts that we'll see in families who've immigrated will be exactly about that, where a son or daughter isn't behaving the way parents think that they should be behaving. Poverty, of course, is a big issue. If you're not employed and you're having to live on whatever your sponsor can provide, or you're having to live on whatever you brought with you, and you're watching your bank balance go down, that can be pretty scary for people, and people can become quite desperate. So, again, it's important for professionals to understand what are the issues that people are wrestling with. I've seen situations where fathers in immigrant families have left the house every morning as if they were going to work, and were leading their families to believe that they were actually working, when in fact they weren't working. They were spending the days, looking for work perhaps, or, going to parks or going to galleries or anything that was free, and then coming home at night as if they had been working. And that was because it was a sense of pride for them that they wanted their families to be proud of them. Meanwhile, of course, when no money's coming in at the end of the month, they have to eventually tell their families what's been going on. And that can be extremely difficult, and especially when family is expecting money to come in and the money doesn't come in. So that can cause a sense of desperation. So families may need some assistance around poverty issues, but in some cases they may be too proud to ask, which we can't blame them for, because many of us might feel the same way. We'll see power shifts sometimes in families as children learn English more quickly, and so they become translators for their parents. And there has been a question about, is it okay for children to translate for their parents? And the answer is it depends on the situation. If it's a social situation, then yes, it is. But in some cases, they may want to have professional translators if they're applying for benefits of some sort or something very important. They may want to make sure that it's not their children who are translating for them, just in case a legal issue comes up later on. But it is difficult if children are acting as translators, because some children feel that they're having a lot more responsibility than they would normally have had. Some kids will become resentful about it. Others will feel that they're adding something to the family and that they're playing an important role. So the short answer to the question of whether children should be translators or not is it depends. It depends on the child, it depends on the family, and it depends on the situation. So you'd want them to make wise decisions about when that would happen and when it would not happen. With respect to power shifts, because of that, parents may become more dependent on their children in a situation like that. And if that happens, it may also mean that the parent is not learning English as quickly as they could be because they're relying on their children. And if that's the situation, that's worth talking with the family about, because that can sometimes happen inadvertently where the parents are not thinking about that may be the impact on the child and on the family. So bringing those kinds of things up can sometimes be helpful for families when they realize that, they need to put more effort. Maybe the parents feel into learning English themselves, and so that their children don't end up feeling overburdened. Okay, when we talk about family tension, we'll see a lot of different things happen. I always remember a family, a young person who was in one of my classes when I taught at Humber College, and he decided at some point to have a mohawk hairstyle. And his family, of course, were very conservative, and they had done very well in their country of origin. So for them to have their son dressing in a mohawk and in torn jeans with piercings was pretty shocking for them, and that caused a lot of tension between them and this young man. But for him, it was a matter of trying to carve out his own identity, separate from his family, and trying also to belong in his new country. And so both sides, both the parents and this young man, had legitimate concerns, but they weren't being discussed as legitimate concerns. What was happening was that each thought that they were right, and of course that was causing tremendous arguments. In situations like that, it can sometimes be important for professionals to help people speak. Just suggest that perhaps the parents might listen and hear some of the struggles that the young man's having about trying to fit in and feeling like an outsider maybe in a lot of ways and wanting to be part of a peer group and having difficulty breaking into a peer group and how tough that can be. Similarly, it's important for the young man to hear his parents' concerns about that they don't want him to lose their original culture. They don't want him to behave in a way that's embarrassing to the family because perhaps family pride is important. It's useful to have people explain, to have parents especially explain, why family pride is so important to somebody. And then, that may go back generations in their own families where there was a certain pride in being part of that family. And the young man may not be aware of that because those stories haven't been shared. It's important to share those stories with young people so that they understand why parents feel the way they do and parents understand why a young person feels the way they do. The other thing that can happen is that young women, they start dating men of different cultures, or men may start dating women of different cultures. And that can cause significant tension in the family as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a bit later on. Around psychological distress that young people experience, we all know that bullying continues to be pretty prominent in the school system, and some schools are dealing with it quite effectively, but some schools are not. And in those situations, young people can suffer pretty extreme effects from bullying. We know that bullying can happen for no reason at all. But bullying can also happen for various types of reasons. If anybody stands out in any way, oftentimes they can draw the attention of bullies. So what we want to do is we want to find out, first of all, because kids don't talk about this sometimes. All we do is we see that they're becoming depressed, or they may be withdrawing. They may be, less willing to talk about things with members of their families. They may sometimes seem ashamed of their family background or where their families came from or the way their families dress. All of those kinds of things may start coming up. It's useful to ask questions about whether children are having difficulty with other children in school and whether that's causing some of those kinds of feelings. If it is, there are a variety of different things that can happen as a result of that. But some of the most important things are helping the children to feel pride in themselves and to understand that, unfortunately, there are unhappy people in the world who take their unhappiness out on other people, but that it doesn't have anything to do with them. So that's an important thing to talk about. Okay, there's another one, another issue that comes up quite frequently, and again, some of my students talked about this, who came from different countries. If their parents have not been documented, or they have refugee claims in, sometimes they're concerned that they could be sent back to their country of origin, or they could face other kinds of sanctions of some sort. They're afraid their parents are going to go to jail. They're afraid the whole family's going to go to jail. They're afraid that they could be sent back and the children could end up staying there with other relatives and the family will be split apart. There's a variety of different kinds of tensions that children can feel in these kinds of situations, and also, of course, the parents can feel. So trying to help people hook up with the resources that they need to get these issues dealt with as quickly as possible is very important. But one of the other things that's really important is helping people deal with their feelings while all of this is going on. It's really useful for both parents and children to share these kinds of feelings. If children are feeling anxious, they need to be able to talk to their parents about these sorts of things. And, if they can't talk to their parents, it's extremely difficult for them because they feel very alone. And they can develop anxiety and other sorts of problems as a result of that. So that's one of those concerns that may be hidden, and in some cases families may not even tell a professional that that's what's going on. So inquire about that. You know, if they are refugees, has everything been settled and are they safely in Canada now? If they're not, you may want to develop a resource list of people who can assist around refugee claims so that you have referral sources for people. Okay, families and children may also experience distress that can result in maladaptive behavior, like drug and alcohol abuse. That's a major problem in a lot of communities. And again, communities tend not to speak about that. Whether you have been in Canada for 3 or 4 generations and have an alcohol problem or a drug problem, or whether you've just arrived in Canada and you're having difficulty adjusting and you're resorting to drug or alcohol abuse. A lot of families don't want to talk about these things, and they will, in some cases, tend to cover for each other as well. So that can be a family secret that somebody is abusing drugs or alcohol. If a family is experiencing considerable distress, it's worth asking a question about that in a diplomatic way and in an understanding way. You want to do it in a way that's not judgmental, because a lot of people turn to drugs and alcohol when they have difficulty, and they are not labeled for it. And so we don't want to have families who have recently immigrated or families, refugee families, feel additional stigma because somebody in the family is resorting to drug or alcohol use. So again, you want to develop a good resource file of different sorts of therapists in some cases. Sometimes therapists will accept people at reduced cost. There are some agencies, Family Service Association, others, who have counselors on staff. In some cases, there's waiting lists. So if families are having a really difficult time, it's better for them to contact a counseling agency sooner rather than later because they may end up on a waiting list. But drug and alcohol abuse can seriously disrupt the family. And in fact, some of you may be familiar with some of the literature around the impact of this sort of thing on families, where you'll see children take on particular roles, for example. The oldest child in some cases another child in the family, may decide that they're responsible somehow and they'll try and fix the family. And that child will take on way too much responsibility at too young an age and ultimately develop perfectionistic tendencies, may develop some obsessive compulsive tendencies. You know, so whether it's a family that has recently arrived in Canada or a family that's been in Canada for generations, drug and alcohol abuse can have that kind of impact. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're checking into that, just to make sure it's not a family secret. But if the family's experiencing distress, inquire about it. They may be acting out of school going on. Well, what's acting out? Acting out happens when children they can't, in some cases, put words to how they feel. So what they do is they act out their feelings. They may be having some incredible conflicts, internal conflicts that are causing them a lot of distress, and they can't talk about them. I mean, most kids are not going to come up to us and say, you know, I'm ashamed of my parents because I'm afraid to bring my friends home, because I'm afraid they're going to embarrass me, and so as a result of that, you know, when they say things like, you know, you're different or whatever, I get really angry, and so I end up punching somebody. They're not going to give you those kinds of reasons. You have to inquire about what's actually happening. The other thing that you have to do is look at symbolic communication. Children will sometimes do and say things, as will adults, you know, that will tell you what's really bothering them. And I always use as an example a young man that I remember working with. whose mother was being beaten by their father. And he couldn't walk up to a professional and say, my mom is being beaten by my dad, and it's breaking my heart, and I feel horrible, and I can't help her, and I don't know what to do. What this kid used to do was really kind of strange. He ended up in a treatment center because of the amount of acting out that he actually did in his classroom at school. So he was referred to a treatment center and ended up in treatment. Well, in treatment, thank goodness, there was another worker and I, and we saw what was going on. What he would do is he would rip his shirt open whenever anything got tense. He'd suddenly rip his shirt open, and it seemed like a very aggressive act to a lot of the workers. They didn't understand why he was doing that. But when I thought about it, I thought, there's something that he's trying to say when he does that, and he may not even know himself what he's trying to say. Interestingly, at times like that, you may want to just use your intuition, because the thing about symbolic communication is when somebody's feeling something strongly enough, sometimes we can pick it up intuitively without them saying it. So you may want to follow your intuition and just check something out. In this case, I said to the young man, are you trying to show us your heart? And he burst into tears. And that's when the whole story came out about his father beating his mother and how he felt helpless and that it was terrible, and he was indeed trying to show us his heart. So there's an example of symbolic communication. Somebody ripping their shirt open, you would have never guessed that was it, but there was something about him doing that that caused me to wonder whether that wasn't what he was trying to do. So follow your own intuition sometimes about things like this, and, just see what it tells you. Okay, another thing. Sometimes kids will choose inappropriate peer groups in order to fit in. We're already seeing that a lot, and, a couple of years ago, even more so, when we were seeing a lot of gang violence in Toronto. I had gang members who later decided that they wanted to get an education with the help of professionals who'd worked with them. And so, when they ended up in my classes, we would have some conversations about that. And they would tell me that the reasons why they joined gangs to begin with was they felt safer. Because you couldn't walk through their neighborhood without being beaten up, so they felt they had to join a gang in order to be safer. In a lot of cases, they might have had a single parent, maybe a mom who was working two jobs, and they were always on their own. So they didn't feel like they were part of a family, and the gang almost felt like a family for them. In other cases, they wanted to have some respect because they didn't feel they were getting respect. They weren't getting respect at school. They weren't getting respect in their communities. So they joined a gang, and as soon as they started wearing their gang colors, all of a sudden they were getting respect. So there were a lot of good reasons why they joined gangs. The only problem was it got them in trouble a lot of times. And for some of them, it put them at risk of being incarcerated. So it was very important that that workers, people who were working with them, understood what it was that was causing them to join the gang in the first place. Because if that's missing in a young person's life, they're going to go looking for it in some way. And sometimes they'll make bad decisions about joining gangs and other, hanging out with different kinds of friends who maybe will accept them where other people won't. So that's something that's worth checking out as well. Okay, let's take a look for a second at refugees, specifically. Dr. Wilson and Drozek have, as I mentioned before, written a wonderful book called Broken Spirits, and you'll see the reference on your screen. They have a way of stating what it feels like to immigrate and what it feels like to be members of a refugee group. And I think that the quote that you're reading on your screen explains what so many of us hear and feel sometimes from people. We're working with people and we feel these kinds of things. We can feel their loneliness. We can feel like they're crying on the inside. We can feel that they're in pain. And some people can't talk about it. They just can't talk about it. And we have to basically respect that they can't talk about it. Sometimes silence is really important. Sometimes it's a way of maintaining someone's dignity. Again, I had a student, an older student, who had come back to school after she and her family had fled from Bosnia. And both she and her mother were raped in Bosnia, but they never talked about it. And they didn't talk about it because for them it was a matter of personal dignity to remain silent. It wasn't until they really knew me, this young woman really knew me well, that she finally talked about it. And it was a horrific experience. And in some ways, she didn't want to talk about it as well because she was trying to shield other people from the horror of what she had gone through. So people will remain silent sometimes for a variety of different reasons, and they're not bad reasons. You know, they're the right reasons for them. So if somebody is silent about something that's happened to them, just ask them what their silence means. Don't ask them to talk necessarily. Just try to ask them what their silence means and see if they'll tell you what that means at least, because that will give you some sense of why they're remaining silent in the first place. What we often see in refugee families, and it has an incredible impact on the family, is when parents, and sometimes cases children as well, have just seen horrific things on fleeing their homeland. Again, I remember a young man in one of my classes who had fled from Vietnam, and he saw, and they were intercepted by pirates, and he had seen his mother and sister brutalized and thrown overboard. And for him, that trauma would never go away. All he could do was he could try to learn to live with it. But again, he felt as if he should have done something. Even though he was just a boy when he fled, he couldn't possibly have done anything. But he carried that guilt with him, and he couldn't speak about it for a very long time. It wasn't until he was in Canada for many years that he could finally even talk about it. So we need to understand that sometimes the trauma is so deep that people are carrying that they can't speak about it at all. If you're seeing, and do inquire about these things, if a family is in distress, ask people, how are they sleeping? Ask them whether there are images or intrusive things that you're having to deal with because of their experience. You know, make it okay for them to talk about it. Because a lot of times people won't talk about it if you're not told that it's okay to talk about it. They may have heightened anxiety, their hands may shake. Again, you'll see substance abuse. Other types of anxieties. They may worry about everything. And you may actually feel frustrated in trying to work with this family. You may even feel frustrated because they seem to worry about everything. Or maybe they talk all the time, or maybe they don't talk at all. But all of that has to do with anxiety. They're experiencing anxiety for a reason. In some cases, they'll have distressing dreams, and that will interfere with their waking moments and how they feel during their waking moments. They may be feeling, just disoriented. They may be having trouble determining, because some of these dreams can be very vivid, which reality is actually true. So you're going to want to maybe inquire about that. Are they sleeping, first of all? If they're not sleeping, they're probably not dreaming. Or they may think they're not sleeping, and in fact they are, and they may remember dreams. So that's something that's worth inquiring about. But if they are sleeping, how well are they sleeping? And are they experiencing distress because of their dreams? You'll see avoidance behavior. People will avoid things that trigger bad memories or very painful or horrendous memories. So watch for triggers and just see, are there people who are avoiding certain kinds of activities, certain kinds of decisions, all manner of things. And if people are suddenly becoming distressed, did something trigger it? If you're having a meeting with families or a family, and some members of the family are becoming very distressed during your meeting, you might want to just backtrack a bit. And, there's a Canadian expression that some people might actually enjoy. when something like that happens, where something suddenly goes out of control, somebody will say, back the truck up. And what that basically means is, let's go back a bit and just see what just happened, because something just went off the rails. So it's quite okay to just say, can we dial this back a bit, and just, because something just happened that caused you, and that family member, to feel distressed. Can you find out what caused that? Because that's important to know. Obviously, you'll see depression, and you know what the symptoms of depression are already. Many of you work in mental health, or you're familiar with it, and you'll know what the symptoms of depression are. Detachment, where people seem withdrawn from other people, they seem withdrawn from life in general, and it's very difficult for them to engage with other people. It may just be that they're, that they're a person who is more of an introvert than an extrovert. That may be the case. But in some cases, they may have been extroverts in their country of origin, and then after things happen, they suddenly, withdraw, and they become introverted because they're too afraid to allow their natural nature to come out. So if somebody seems detached or not engaged, make it okay for them to talk about why and what happened around that. And you can make it okay by basically being kind and by being accepting of what they have to say. And in fact, in some cases, using active listening, reflecting back to them, different kinds of meanings, or asking questions. One of the things we don't do enough, interestingly, as human service workers or people who are human service professionals, is we don't ask enough questions. So often when people say things, we don't fully understand what they mean, and we move on. If we don't fully understand and we're curious about what somebody's saying, then it's good not to move on. What we need to do is just say, when you said that, can you help me understand why you said that, or what that actually means for you? Let them talk a little bit more about that. It'll give you some interesting insights into some of the things that we're actually struggling with. In some cases, you're going to see hypervigilance. What hypervigilance means is they notice everything, every subtlety, every detail, and in some cases, they will react to it. In other words, nothing goes by them. They will notice if your mood has changed. They will notice if you're not quite yourself today. They will notice what you're wearing. They will notice how you speak. They will notice how you feel about them. They'll notice all kinds of things. And that's what hypervigilance is. People who have hypervigilance, interestingly, make very good detectives because they don't miss anything. But for most of us who aren't detectives, it's very difficult to live with that. We're noticing everything, and where a lot of things actually trigger reactions can be extremely distressing for people. So you want to watch for that as well. Just take a look and see what else we have here. I'm moving back to the glass in a moment. Okay, outbursts of anger. This one is really interesting because a lot of times people don't check what are the reasons for these outbursts of anger. I think sometimes we jump to conclusions. This is an angry person, or this is a hurt person, or this is somebody who's sad. It may be more than that. I can always remember years ago, I worked with a young man who had a developmental disability. And he would suddenly explode in his residence, and he would throw chairs around and scream at people, and it was very distressing for staff as well as for him. But what would happen is he would end up being put in isolation. And he hated that because he was actually a very engaging young man when he wasn't angry. And I sat down with him and I said to him, can you tell me what usually gets you that angry? And he said, you know what? I don't know. I don't know what gets me that angry. I just suddenly feel so angry and I can't control myself. It was a very interesting conversation because when that happens, when somebody doesn't know why they're angry, and there doesn't seem to be something that actually precipitates their anger, then it's maybe a good idea to have them checked out medically, because sometimes we can miss things like head injuries, where families or individuals in refugee families have fled from war or they've been dislocated because of some natural disaster, it's possible that they've suffered head injury, or it's possible that they suffered a head injury earlier in their lives. And sometimes a head injury can cause those kinds of effects. They can cause sudden angry outbursts for no apparent reason. So if that's what somebody's experiencing, please make sure that they're checked out medically. They need to be checked out medically when that happens. In this person's case, he did indeed have a brain lesion, and he had mild epileptic seizures that were setting off these kinds of angry outbursts. And so we got him a good neurologist, and this good neurologist put him on a very low dose of tegretol, and the outburst stopped. In fact, he became so great that he was able to return to his home community, and he still works in a florist shop. This was probably 10 years later. He always loved working with flowers, and he works in a florist shop, and he's doing very well. But he could not have done that 20 years ago had we not found out that this is what was causing him problem. Okay, let's take a really good look at the results of trauma. And as I mentioned to you, you'll see that some of these, and I'll talk a little bit about it as well. You're going to see some of these correspond to some extent with the DSM-4 and 5. But I just think that Dr. Wilson has a better way of explaining some of these kinds of things. And you can start to understand why people who've been seriously traumatized will develop these kinds of symptoms. Let's look at something that he refers to as the inert self. These are people who've suffered horrible damage, who've gone through horrific events, often over prolonged periods of time. And keep in mind that there are people who are refugees in Canada whose trauma may go back generations. There may have been generations of ethnic conflict or other kinds of issues in their country of origin that in fact has changed their physiology and in fact has changed their genetic makeup. Because we now know that that happens, that where trauma is significant and has happened for a long time, there can actually be intergenerational transmission of the genetic effects of that. So, for somebody who's displaying something called an inert self, that's somebody who seems extremely helpless. They seem absolutely unable to help themselves. And they may be asking constantly for help. This may be the person, who calls and calls and calls and calls. In some cases, it may be somebody who can't even leave their house, who's just terrified. Sound is fun. The sound on?
No, I think the whole thing is
Oh. Is anyone else experiencing that, where the screen is frozen and you can't hear me? Okay. So somebody's saying they can hear and see fine now. Okay, so I'm going to continue that. Okay, so again, referring to the inert self, this is somebody who may not even be able to leave their house, where they just have given up and they basically lost their will to live. I just want to talk a little bit, I want to backtrack a little bit about this. This has to do with the development of our sense of self. And, if you want to go back as far as Freud, he talked about ego development. All of us have to develop throughout, our early stages of life. We have to develop a sense of ourselves. And that sense of ourselves is reflected in the eyes and the behavior of other people. Other people in many ways help us to understand who we are. But we also have our own internal sense of self. We have our own internal voice that talks to us. What happens to people whose selves or whose egos actually are attacked because they've become so overwhelmed by the events in their lives, they'll splinter apart in some cases, or in some cases they'll change so that they can't cope in ways that they used to. And it'll take a lot of healing and it'll take a lot of help to try to get people to reintegrate their sense of themselves. With somebody who has an inert self, it's going to take a long time. It'll be baby steps trying to help this person gradually start to regain a sense of themselves, start to regain a sense of hope. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about how best to do that, to help somebody start to take those baby steps back to who they actually are. So when we're talking about the self, what we're talking about is a person's sense of who they are, and their behavior, the way they speak, who they hang out with, what they think about things, what their belief systems are, all have to do with that sense of themselves. And when they lose that because they're overwhelmed or because of horrible trauma, their self can become inert, literally frozen in place. So that's the first one. The second one is the empty self, where you'll see passivity. You'll see a person who just seems depleted of energy, and that corresponds with what we'll see as a diagnosis of depression quite often. The other thing is, it's worse than that. For people who've been seriously traumatized, the depression goes so deep that you'll almost feel a sense of darkness yourself when you're talking with them. When you leave their home, where you're seeing family members who have this empty self, what will happen is you yourself will feel depleted of energy. You'll feel like you want to go home and sleep, or you just don't want to have to deal with anything. Recognize when that happens. So that's something called projective identification. In other words, what's happened is the way this person feels is so powerful that it's come through their own boundaries, their own personal boundaries, and it's entered yours. In other words, it's gotten past your own boundaries to the point where you've now integrated part of how they feel. That's what projective identification can do. So you need to be aware that when that's happening, you're experiencing someone else's feelings. You're not experiencing your own. Okay? So keep that in mind. So the empty self really often refers to someone who is very severely depressed, to the point where they're so depleted that they can't follow through on things. So you may be trying to help them fill out forms or do other kinds of things. They can't do it. At this point, they're not able to do it. They need some other things to help them pull themselves and their sense of hope back together before they can even do those kinds of things. So recognize that if you're getting what seems like resistance from somebody, watch for that, because it may be that you're dealing with somebody who has an empty sense of themselves. Okay, another one, the fragmented self. That's where you'll see what we call identity diffusion, where they're not in touch with themselves. There's a sort of disengagement from themselves, where they don't know themselves who they are anymore. And so it's very difficult for them to present themselves effectively to other people. And often you'll see it characterized by a sort of fragility, where you're almost feeling like you have to be very careful with this person, because otherwise they'll collapse completely. They're often extremely anxious, and they're often extremely distrustful. So watch for that. You may be, if that's what you're seeing, you may be dealing with a fragmented self. In other words, this person needs to be able to reconnect a bit with even part of who they think they are before they can actually go on and do some of the things that may be being demanded of them, like finding a job or other sorts of things. Okay. The imbalanced self. This is the one that probably most corresponds to things like diagnoses in the DSM of borderline personality disorder, where there's a high degree of emotional instability, where their core issues are fears of rejection and abandonment. This is a person where, boy, if you put your foot wrong in a family interview, this person will suddenly attack you. They'll come out of nowhere and suddenly just exhibit extreme emotion. You need to understand at that point that what you're dealing with is an imbalanced self. And what you may have triggered there is you may have triggered their own fears of rejection or abandonment. So watch for that. And that's the time when you again want to dial it back and talk about what caused that. And if possible, try to explain that you weren't rejecting or abandoning the person in any way, that in fact something else was happening because the person may not be reading you correctly. And you'll see this in family meetings. And sometimes you'll have people who feel very much, or who exhibit, different people in families who exhibit different selves. And that can become quite complicated. If you have somebody who has an imbalanced self and somebody who has an inert self sitting in the same family meeting, you're going to have to be paying attention to a lot of different things. What it may also mean, though, is that from time to time, you're going to want to meet with individuals in the family with the permission of the others, because you don't want to ally yourself with one family member and not others. And we'll talk more about that later. But sometimes the family itself realizes that there are some people in the family who need more help than other people do. And so they're more willing to put their own needs aside a little bit for a short period of time in order for someone else to get some help. So those are all things that need to be negotiated. But if you're dealing with somebody who has an imbalanced self and they love you one day and they hate you the next, don't take it personally, because honestly it has nothing to do with you. It's part of their own emotional instability because of what they've gone through and because of maybe something that you have triggered in this person inadvertently, something you said that caused them to feel that you were rejecting them. Whether or not that was your intent or whether or not that's what you did, that may be what they perceive that you did, and they'll react to that perception rather than what you actually did. So watch for that. If that happens, then it's probably time to try to go back a step or two and let the person know that that was not your intent, that wasn't the way you were going, and try and follow it with a positive comment about them, so they realize that they're not being rejected or abandoned. Okay, what happens with people who have this high degree of emotional instability? They have real difficulty maintaining relationships. And sometimes they'll break off relationships with the family. In other words, they'll become removed from the family, or the family will break off relationships with them because they don't understand what's actually happened to this person and why they're reacting the way they do. And they don't know how to help them. They just know that they're a source of extreme irritation. So sometimes they'll want to get rid of them. This may be a person who tries to manipulate the family and get things out of them. And the reason why they're doing that is because it's the way that they've learned to cope. They've found that the only way they can get their needs met is by attempting to manipulate other people to meet their needs. So if you think about it, if you reframe it, that's not a bad thing to want your needs met. Perhaps the way they're going about it is not a good way. But it's not bad to want to get your needs met. Everybody wants to get their needs met. It's just that this person may be doing it in a way that's very offensive to other people. Okay, the overburdened self. This is where you'll see a person who engages maybe in ritualistic behavior of some sort. I've actually seen people who have to count their steps several times before they can even go out the front door. You'll see people who will, clean and clean and clean and clean, and they're still not feeling confident that their house is clean. You'll see people who have all kinds of little personal rituals that they have to engage in on a regular basis just to get them through their day. And that's a person who's feeling extremely overburdened. They may have suffered some terrible losses, and so they may engage in hoarding behavior as well, where they have a fear of letting go of anything, so they don't throw anything out. When you suffered horrible losses and you don't want to lose anything else, that can sometimes be projected onto objects. It can be projected onto people. So you can end up with extremely obsessive compulsive behavior and ritualistic behavior because, and take that as a sign of extreme grief and loss, where somebody has suffered traumatic loss, and this is one of the ways they're trying to cope with it, by making their world more predictable, and by not letting go of it, and so then they engage in hoarding behavior. Okay, the agnomic self, this is a person who is a loner. You'll see them avoid completely relationships or getting too close to anybody. As a matter of fact, they may become quite fearful if they feel that they're getting close to someone. They'll do something to break off the relationship. This will be the person who you're going to feel like you're chasing them around all the time. You're going to feel as if they're not going to answer your phone calls. They're not going to be home when you come to see them. They're going to be somebody who the family sort of says, oh, you know, him. This is a person who doesn't trust the world. This is a person who's learned that the world is not a safe place, and that the best thing to do is to just rely on yourself, to just stay with yourself, and not engage. Don't engage with other people. Don't engage with the world, or engage as little as you possibly can. It's important to recognize that there's a reason for the mistrust. There's a reason why this person can't form relationships anymore, can't become involved with people, and just feels safer being alone. Interestingly, years ago I worked with somebody like this who regularly canceled appointments, who regularly didn't show up even at his own home when I was supposed to meet him there. Never showed up like I tried inviting him out to somewhere for coffee where we could talk over coffee. Didn't show up. Basically avoided me as much as he possibly could. What I did, which was sort of interesting that actually helped in that situation, was I told him that I had to bring my dog, and I wanted to meet him in a park. And he actually showed up for that. He felt more comfortable with the dog than he felt with other human beings. So sometimes things like that can actually be helpful. So, think about what seems to pique this person's interest, and then see if there's some way that you can build on that, to use that in some way. Okay, the conventional self. We're now starting to look at somebody who is a little bit better adjusted to society. This is somebody whose coping strategies are a little bit better than the ones I've described so far. In other words, they're seeking safety. They're wanting some connection with other people. They may not be quite sure how to do that. They may be extremely anxious about how to do it. And so they may be overly conformist, or they may be overly people-pleasing for that reason. And their need to please other people and be accepted may be what's at the basis of their anxiety. And that may also lead to them being rejected by others. In other words, they seem too eager. So that's referred to as a conventional self, the person who tries to conform to every aspect of society and tries to conform with whatever other people are talking about or what other people are doing, just to try to feel part of what's going on. I remember talking to a person in a lineup at Tim Hortons, and this man was just a delightful person. But he told me that he'd been having trouble making friends in Canada. He was Tamil. And so what he did was he noticed Canadians go to Tim Hortons. So what he did was he donned a toque and he donned a big coat, and he went up to Tim Hortons and stood in line with the Canadians, because that made him feel more connected and made him feel more Canadian. And I mean, if you look at it, it was a pretty good strategy, because at least he could chat people up that way. But that was an example of somebody who was starting to make the adjustment. He was trying really hard to be Canadian, and he still had a high degree of anxiety about it, but he was moving in a right general direction. He was noticing things, and he was trying to engage. So that's an example of conventional self. Grandiose self is where you'll see somebody who is seeking high position constantly, maybe within their own community, maybe within the society itself, where they want very much to have recognition. They want external acclaim. They want praise for what they're doing. And so they may engage in certain kinds of volunteer activities, or they may try to join boards of directors, or they may try to become elected officials. What they're trying to do, again, is they're trying to fit in and gain the respect that they would like to have, because internally they don't necessarily feel a genuine sense of themselves, a genuine respect for themselves. And so, and I'm not suggesting by any means, and some of you I'm sure will laugh now, that every politician fits this criteria. Some people do actually enter public life because they want to serve. But sometimes the reason why you might enter public life or seek a certain kind of position is because you want external acclaim to make up for the lack of internal acclaim. In other words, you can't give yourself credit very well, so you look for external people to give you credit instead. That obviously often conforms to what we would call a narcissistic personality. But again, it's a coping strategy, and I think we have to realize that all of these things are not intended as negative labels. They're intended to be, demonstrations that these are ways people try to cope with overwhelming events and the effects of trauma. Okay, let's move on to the cohesive self. Now we're starting to talk about somebody whose coping strategies are a little stronger. This is a person who's bouncing back from the adversity that they've had to deal with. They feel in control inside of themselves. There's a certain vitality to them, and they're more relaxed people to be with because there's a sense of security that they have that maybe other family members don't necessarily have. This may be a person who has a high degree of ethics. They may be somebody who maybe stood up against injustice in their country of origin, may have even suffered torture because of it. Again, I'm reminded of an Iranian student who I once had, who had been tortured horribly in Iran. And he was tortured because he stood up against what he saw as human rights abuses there. Strangely enough, you would think that he would be suffering many of the other earlier effects that we saw. But in fact, he was suffering some of them. He had post-traumatic stress symptoms, for sure. But he had a certain sense of himself, and he was a pleasure to be with because of that sense of himself. He had an internal certainty that the things that he stood up for were right, and he had to suffer because of them, but he felt almost proud of his suffering because he'd had the guts to stand up. So that's the kind of thing, that builds resilience, that allows a person to bounce back because they never really lose their sense of themselves. They've gone through horrible things, they're suffering, but they never lost the sense of themselves. And so they did okay. And it's a person who continues to take their values and their beliefs into their new life with them and often gains respect because of that. So that's something we would refer to as a cohesive self. All right. Looking to see if there's any questions yet. It's okay to ask questions. Please do if they're coming up. I can see them on the screen here, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. The accelerated self. This is somebody who is a go-getter. This is somebody who can accomplish 10 times more than most other people can. What you'll see is that they're resolute. They tend to be highly morally principled. They may engage in altruistic activities of some sort, and they can get a lot done. They may seek social change in various ways. And the thing about somebody who has an accelerated self, and by the way, that is driven by a sense of anxiety that they feel that bad things could happen if I don't do something. The thing about an accelerated self is they will see something coming sometimes long before other people do. And they'll try and plan for it, or they'll try and do something to prevent it or to foster it in some way. So these are people that you sometimes will see referred to as visionaries in our society. They're people who can see the horizon. They can see what's going to happen, what needs to happen. They have a sense of how things should be, and they will go after it, and sometimes in a very aggressive way. And again, these are people who may earn other people's respect, or they may actually scare other people because they're so able. And it's almost scary the way they can sort of look at the future and potentially see the future. So that's the kind of person, this is how you would experience somebody who has an accelerated self. Okay, let's take a look. Do people move between the different kinds of self or generally stay as one kind? Is it stable personality traits or is it changeable? That's a really good question because I think people can move through different stages for sure. And hopefully they will, because especially where you see people who have very difficult coping strategies, where they are not coping very well, the whole goal is to help them move, hopefully, into higher level coping strategies. So yes, they can definitely move out of a certain sense of self. The people who don't, who maybe remain in an inert self, those are the people you would worry about the most because they can become suicidal and they can end up ending their own lives. And you'll see that also with people who have severe depression or other kinds of mental health issues that put them at higher risk of, or very severe forms of post-traumatic stress disorder. That will put them at greater risk of suicide. And so, sadly, there will be some people who, for whatever reason, no matter what we do, we're not able to help them. And so they never do move out of that stage and end up having lost the hope to such a degree that they may end up taking their own lives. Generally, that's not the case, though. Generally, with some help and gradual reintegration of themselves, they will move to these other types of selves. And in fact, they may incorporate different aspects of different selves as they go through life and as their experience in life goes. So I hope I answered that question. If I didn't, please take another one, and I'll do my best. Okay. Another question is, do only adults experience this, or do children exhibit it as well? And the answer to that question is that yes, children do exhibit aspects of these selves, or they may even exhibit all aspects of a certain self. But they'll do it based on their developmental stages. And so you'll see different kinds of things acted out. So, for example, a child who has an accelerated self may actually be demonstrating a certain kind of bossiness in the schoolyard, where they're telling other kids what to do, whereas an adult, may be a little more circumspect about that. They may not go around bossing other people, but they'll try and convince them, but they may do it more diplomatically. So yes, you'll see these same kinds of characteristics, but depending on the developmental stage, you'll see them acted out maybe in a little bit different way. So an adult won't be necessarily as bossy looking, although they may be, but a child will be more bossy and not as diplomatic, right? So that would be an example of what would happen with an accelerated self. A child who's extremely withdrawn, or who may not be in control of their bladder or their bowels. That may be a child that's exhibiting symptoms of an inert self. So where an adult may not, they may not have bowel or bladder issues, but they can't get out of bed. A child may have bowel and bladder issues as well, and they may be terribly embarrassed by that in the school system. So, yes, you will see some of those things, but they'll take a different form perhaps. But they'll be examples of the same kind of problem. Okay, hope I answered that one as well. The integrated transcendent self. This is what we're actually aiming for. We're aiming for self-actualized people who have successfully overcome adversity. Now, that's actually true of all of us. This isn't just true of people who are refugees. with everybody with whom we work. We're trying to help people be the best that they can be. And that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about someone who has an integrated transcendent self. It's a person who is not afraid to seek growth through various types of challenges, who has a sense of vitality, and who is interested in things, and who may also have highly developed spiritual values. And so they live their lives in a certain way. You know, they'll dress beautifully, there'll be a certain richness to their lives, they'll read, they'll engage in cultural pursuits, you know, they'll do a variety of different things to promote their own growth. And at the same time, this is a person who will also try to enrich the lives of other people. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about an integrated transcendent self. And that's ultimately the goal that probably all of us are trying to reach, but that we're also trying to especially reach with people who've been through, you know, extreme difficulties in their lives. We want them eventually to get to that point. And even though, say, someone who's in an inert state may not even realize that it's possible, eventually, hopefully, as they move through different stages, they'll be able to eventually reach that point. That's what we're aiming for. Okay. Someone asked a question. I'm just going to help you here about racism, homophobia, and sexism. I'm not totally clear on the question. I'm assuming about the presence of racism and sexism and homophobia in various communities. It's a good question, if that is the question, because sometimes what we run into is people who come from different countries who are racist towards us or who are homophobic towards us. And in that kind of situation, whether it's cultural or not, we have to confront it. We have to deal with it in Canada. Because it's part of a person's integration into Canadian society to begin to understand that Canadians have a different view of that, and it's not acceptable. So it's important to set personal limits. If what you're finding is that some of the people that you're working with are exhibiting homophobic or racist attitudes towards you, it's important to set a personal limit around that and let the person know it's not acceptable. And what you're doing, by the way, when you do that, is you're also letting them know that it's not acceptable for other people to treat them that way. So you're modeling really good behavior by setting a personal limit, do it in a diplomatic way, but you just say, you know what, this is not okay with me. I don't want you to speak to me this way. And in Canada, this is not how we do business. We don't see other people this way. We all try to get along. And you explain it to the person. And you do the best that you can, you know, in those kinds of situations, but you don't allow it. Nor should an agency allow it, by the way. I've seen agencies step in with clients who are behaving in that way. And I've seen executive directors or supervisors step in and set limits and say that's unacceptable. And if it continues, you know, you're going to be without services for a period of time until you can come back in and handle things a little bit differently. I mean, they'll hang in with them up to a point, but then they'll set the limit and say that's not acceptable. And it is good to demonstrate that for people. Okay, besides heavy trauma, torture, war, etc., would you see those results of trauma from racism, homophobia, and sexism? Yes. I mean, definitely you can, because, I mean, you'll see them in different degrees, I think. It really depends on the person and how something impacts the person. You know, somebody who is dealing with a lot of racism in their country of origin or here, they will exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They may exhibit fear of going out. They may exhibit fear of, you know, engaging with other people. So absolutely you can see that kind of thing. And again, it'll be a matter of degree, as are the reactions to war and overwhelming events. Different people will react in different ways. But yes, you can see these kinds of different cells emerge through that, for sure. Absolutely you can. Let's see what else we have going on here. Daughter's insistence to always interpret for mom with her consent is actually counterproductive. She declined doctor's suggestion of an interpreter. How to proceed. Okay, that's a good one. All right, so there's a reason. I think when these kinds of things happen, there's always a reason. So it's important to sit down, I think, with the daughter and the mom and to talk with them about why this is so important. And to just hear what their reasons are. Sometimes I think we get tied up in trying to give people our reasons for why they shouldn't do things when we haven't fully understood their reasons for doing things. So I would spend a little bit of time and come across in a very accepting way, in an understanding way, and ask the mom and the daughter, why this is so important to them? Why is it so important the daughter translates? And why no one else can translate? And just hear them out. And actually, if you can, reinforce some of those things. It's understandable that you wouldn't trust someone else other than your daughter because you don't understand the language and you don't know this person. I mean, we were talking a minute ago about people who are very mistrustful as a result of their experiences. And one of the reasons why, she may not be letting anyone other than her daughter translate, she doesn't trust anybody else to translate. So it's important to get to that issue and deal with that issue first before actually dealing with whether or not her daughter should be translated. So I would sit down with that family and try and find out first why it's so important and acknowledge that she doesn't trust anyone else and gradually try to move from that place of complete distrust, to over time, like asking her, what might cause you to trust somebody? Who might you feel more comfortable with? At a time when your daughter isn't available, what if you had to have a translator? What would you feel more comfortable with? And I understand that you don't trust people. You don't trust a lot of people. Actually reinforcing and saying that that's okay. It's okay not to trust people at this point. So I'm hoping that answers the question, just to see what the reasons actually are. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, I think we've got most of those questions. Okay, that's it. I think we've answered most of those questions so far. Okay, so let's move on. I think we're halfway through, at least, or more than halfway through. All right, so let's talk about how to help people. So the first half, we talked about what happens to people and what you're likely to see exhibited in families. In the second half, we're now going to talk about how do you actually help people. Now, what's really interesting is if you look at the different selves that I've just described, many of them are actually related to Maslow's hierarchy. People who can't come out of their own homes, who are inert. For them, basic physiological needs are something that you're going to want to make sure are met. Other people who are mistrustful, they're going to have safety needs, as you can see. Other people who are trying to engage but don't quite know how and they have a high degree of anxiety about it, they have friendship, family, possibly sexual intimacy needs. So as you go up the scale, you're going to actually see that Maslow's hierarchy relates to the different selves and the different progressions of selves that people go through as they're experiencing trauma or beginning to cope with trauma. So use this. Use this as a good way of helping people. People who are in an inert self situation, basic steps, helping a person get out and get a little bit of exercise, making sure that the person's eating enough. Those kinds of things, making sure that they're getting enough sleep, and if they're not, maybe accompanying them to a doctor to see whether they can get some help so that they can get some sleep. That will start to help a person, even in an inert self situation, begin to recover. So use Maslow's hierarchy to see where people are and start to try to meet the needs based on that. Okay, so starting with basics. where a family isn't even meeting its basic needs, I can tell you they're never going to deal with their safety issues. They're not going to deal with engagement issues, and they're sure not going to be able to go out and get a job. So the first thing is they have to have food, warm clothes, housing, all of those kinds of things. They have to learn how to support one another. And I mentioned before how important it is to share family stories and history. Develop certain kinds of routines. There are families who are not having dinner. There are families who are not having dinner together. Start to encourage them to do things like that. Have dinner together. Watch a movie together. Have some daytime activities. Things that don't cost any money. You know, get them starting to enjoy each other's company again, especially in families where there's a lot of conflict. Get them out doing some other things together that are fun, so that their only experience of family isn't conflict. Help them connect with other families where they're getting some mutual support. Get the kids involved in other groups with activities at school, other sorts of things where they're starting to connect with other kids. If possible, you know, maybe there are people in the neighborhood who are willing to give kids a part-time job, give them an opportunity to earn a little bit of money. If transportation is an issue, there may be people, and sometimes even some of the families who you're working with can help other families with that. There are confidentiality issues, but you could certainly check to see whether that's okay to talk to someone else. Like if you know somebody is going somewhere every day and another person doesn't have transportation, asking if they can get a ride with that person. You know, there are a variety of different ways of actually getting people to engage. Show people how they can contribute to the community. If somebody is at a stage where they want some recognition and they want respect, they can get involved in political campaigns, they can be involved in various clubs and organizations like the Rotary or Kiwanis or other kinds of clubs. There may be informal social clubs. You want to get them involved in places where they can start to play a role and bring some of their skills, especially people who are underemployed. They need to be able to use their skills. So finding various types of activities that they can get involved in where they can use those skills is really important. Focus on strengths and redefine problems as needs. Too often when we start with families, the minute a social worker or a professional walks in, that's their cue to talk about problems. That's not where you want to start. You want to start by doing something completely different. You want to walk in, introduce yourself, sit down, and the first thing out of your mouth is, tell me all the things that are good about your family. That will totally change the discourse. What you'll see is you'll see shock on people's faces because they've been defined as a problem family. And here's somebody coming in and asking what's good about them for the first time. Get them talking about their strengths. It's really important. Just get each family member to talk about the strengths of somebody else. You know, what's good about this person? What's good about that person? What are some of the great things so-and-so has done? You know, get them talking about something nice for a change. When the problems start to come out where they say, well, you know, she never keeps her mouth shut, you want to help them redefine that as a need and say, okay, can we restate that a little bit more diplomatically? You'd like her sometimes to have some quiet time? That's a need. Sometimes I need quiet time. You know, can we work together on that where sometimes I can have some quiet time? That's a need. So in other words, you don't have to tell somebody to shut up. You can just say, look, I need some quiet time right now. You know, help me with that. And that's a different way of saying it. Okay, assisting families to help and be a support to others. Cooking nights, card nights, walking groups, all of those things are possible, nothing costs money. You know, if you see other people walking in the neighborhood, ask if you can join them. Sometimes people are happy to walk with other people. But all of these things cost very little, and they can invite other people over. Have a potluck dinner. Get a few other families together over at your place and get each person to bring a dish and share a meal together. Those kinds of things start to cause children and families to feel like they're part of a larger community. And that's a great way to help people to hear. Okay, where people are in really, really tough shape, or where families are in really tough shape, what you want to do, let's say somebody has been a victim of torture. Build your own skills. Bring in, or make referrals to Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. talk with staff there and find out some things that you need to know, and you share some of your expertise with them. Because just as social support works for families, it also works for us as professionals. So take part in that. Go to some of these organizations and find some things out that you wouldn't otherwise have. Talk to some of the staff of the organizations. Partner with family service organizations that exist in the community. If they haven't got counselors who have gotten training in helping people who are victims of trauma, then talk with them about how that might actually help. About making workshops available, for example. If you have someone in your organization who has expertise in that, offer to do a free workshop for another organization so that they can learn about that as well. You'll want to meet with regular resources, like perhaps psychiatrists in the hospitals or in community settings, and ask them if they will see clients who are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe they need medication assistance, or maybe they need counseling for depression. OHIP does cover it. So trying to build both family doctors who will do some counseling, some of them do, and psychiatrists who will see people. You need to get a resource list together so that you can start to build those resources and make referrals for some of your clients. Ask to speak at boards of directors. Boards meet monthly. If you feel that some staff of agencies need specialized training, go and do a short presentation, 15-minute presentation, and talk about the importance of staff becoming versed in these kinds of things so that they can help people. Just as you want to build your own skills by going to different organizations and learning, you also want to help other organizations to do that. You yourself can become trained in cognitive behavioral and dialectical behavioral approaches for clients. Now, the question came up, how? The Toronto Traumatology Institute runs courses. They have a variety of courses in cognitive behavioral, and they do it in conjunction with other post-secondary educational organizations. In some cases, if you're working for an agency, your agency may actually pay you to take a course and bring the information back to other staff. And you can do that in staff meetings, for example. If someone's been trained in cognitive behavioral, they can do presentations for other staff on what happens in cognitive behavioral. Same thing with dialectical behavioral. Go to almost any college or university library and you will find tapes on dialectical behavioral approaches. There's sometimes lectures available on the internet or on YouTube. If you Google them, you may find some really good resources on the internet that will teach you certain skills in dialectical. Plus, there are books available. You can subscribe to journals that are of interest to you that also will teach you something. Some of the things that can really help, just on an individual basis or when you're working with a family, help them reframe their responses to situations. Like when somebody in a family, and this has happened, I saw in a family where a kid has said to another kid, "Oh, you're so gay." So what you want to do is in that situation, you want to just say, okay, can we stop the process for a second? What did you actually want to say? What was upsetting to you about what just happened? And then get the person to reframe it in a different way. And then explain to them after they've done it, just say, that was a lot better. That was great. And then say, now you tell me what was wrong with the way you did it the first time. And let them tell you. Once you've given them some really good positive feedback that they've actually done something well, oftentimes they will themselves tell you what they shouldn't have done in the first place. So that's a way of helping people to reframe things. The other thing is causing people to question certain automatic thoughts. Oh my God, things are going to get worse. Okay, let's dial that back a bit. What makes you think it's going to get worse? Or somebody will say something negative about themselves and say, ask the question, are you being fair to yourself right now? Is that a fair thing, a fair assessment of you? And ask other family members, what do you think? Do you think that's true? And start to question those automatic thoughts. that usually are usually the result of negativity or people overestimating risk or underestimating their own ability. Let other people tell them that, that's not really the way it is. Ask people about negative self-talk. You can pick up on it. You can say, you often seem to say negative things about yourself. What's going on inside when you do that? Ask them about it. And then tell them, let them know that they can change that. They can change those kinds of things. Use scheduled activities of various types, that will help people gain skills. And, sometimes get them graded task assignments. Things, okay, today, I know you have difficulty talking to people, but today, when you go to the store, make a special effort to talk to one person. Even if it's the cashier, ask her how her day is today. And just start to engage that person. It's a task assignment, and they can gain some confidence while we're doing it. Okay, advanced communication skills. Returning communication biz is really important. Now, let me just explain what a communication biz is. When somebody comes in the morning and says, wow, you really look nice today, you want to return that bid. You don't want to say, oh, I think I look awful. You want to say, thank you. That's so nice of you to say. You so often look great yourself. And that's a return of the communication bid. That means they're going to do it again. Okay, so you want to encourage that. Have a reassuring tone of voice when you talk to people. And use an encouraging approach. You focus on their strengths more than you focus on anything else. Teach the importance of acknowledging, explaining, and apology. If you think about it, when things go wrong with other people, it's mostly because we didn't acknowledge what they had to say, or we did something and didn't offer an explanation for it, or when we did something wrong, we put our foot in something, we didn't apologize for it. So, explain that these things are important, and when someone speaks to you, acknowledge what they're saying. Don't just move on or make the next sentence about you. Explain. If something seems to be perplexing to somebody, explain why you did something. And finally, don't be afraid to apologize if you've made a mistake. Just say, look, I didn't mean to offend you. I'm really sorry. My intention was, offer an explanation. Positive sandwiches. When you have to say something difficult to someone, say something half decent first, something good, then say what you have to say, and then follow it up with something else that's positive. You're usually such a cheerful person, so I was surprised when you didn't acknowledge me at lunch today, because usually you're not like that. That's a positive sandwich. Okay, it's going to be a lot easier for the person to hear that you had problems with them not acknowledging you than if you just walked up and say, why didn't you talk to me at lunch yesterday? You're going to get a different kind of response. You want to reinforce family roles that are based on strengths rather than rigidity. You know what? If Dad's a good cook in the family, he should be doing more of the cooking. If Mom wants to go out to work, she should be the one going out to work more than Dad. It's important to talk about those kinds of things, whether the roles in families are too rigid, and are they serving people well. Okay, helping families replace negative comments with positive ones. That's a given, fairly easy to do, because you've said that in a more positive way. That's just a call. As soon as you're talking to the family, something happens, because you've said that in a more positive way. Helping families to alter their negative attribution. You never talk to me. I think you hate me. Okay? Is that fair? Do you hate her? No, I don't hate her. Sometimes I get absorbed in things. Okay, here's a negative attribution. She thinks he hates her, or he thinks she hates him, when in fact, he's just absorbed in something else. It's important to start to reverse those kinds of negative attributions and try and think better of people rather than thinking the worst of them. Showing families how to listen and validate each other. Sometimes you have to stop people from yelling. You have to just say, okay, well, slow down. Okay, let's everybody just sit quietly for a moment, and then let's one by one each explain how we feel about something, and the rest of us are going to listen. And you can almost be a traffic cop. You can put your hand up and say, yep, we were going to listen. When someone starts to talk or cut somebody off. And you know what? If it's the same person and you have to go up several times, kind of dawn on them that, wow, I interrupt people a lot. So it's important for them to know that. It's okay to interview experts in different areas. We're often very shy about that. So we need to sometimes go and interview people in various areas. We can ask them for resources, ask them for different things that we want to know. You can use human and book resources or other kinds of written resources for that. One of the things is when we're reading the newspaper and we see experts quoted and we like what they have to say, you know what? Call them up. Call them up. Make contact with them because you never know when you're going to need their expertise for something. Okay, your own sense of sanity is very important in working with families. You want your own support network. You want to use your own staff meetings to present new information. Get people to bring in articles and talk about them. Do little workshops of your own, mini workshops. If you know some good videos, bring them in, show them for the whole staff, and have each staff member be able to do that. Look at Charity Village on the internet, and you'll see free workshops. You can go to a lot of free workshops. As I mentioned before, subscribe to journals. If you find that you're suffering compassion fatigue, in other words, you're dreading having to go to work and have other symptoms, or you're not sleeping or other kinds of things because you're bringing your this home with you all the time, you may need to seek some mental health support for yourself, okay, if you need it. There are TED Talks. They're called on the internet. And there's the address. Check them out. There's some amazing lectures that are available on the internet that you can learn. Okay, pitfalls of families. You can get over-involved. You can get enmeshed in the family. As if you're a member of the family and you're getting involved in the family dynamics. When that happens, you have to take a step back and just say, okay, this is not my family. They have their own journey. I need to maintain my objectivity or I'm not going to be any help to them. It's very important not to get enmeshed in the family itself. Same thing with transference and countertransference. There are going to be times when you're going to experience a child's situation you're going to relate too closely to it. It's going to resonate for you. It's times like that that you have to remind yourself that you are not this person. No matter how much you think you know them, you don't. They know themselves better than you do. And so you have to take a step back and let that person explain to you who they are instead of projecting who you believe them to be onto them. Around boundary crossing. That's a really important one. So we think that just because we work with refugee and immigrant families who have different cultural mores, that they are no less entitled to having their boundaries respected than us. A lot of times what happens is we'll get a cultural argument. Yes, but, they invited me for dinner and it would be insulting to say no. Well, actually, no, it isn't insulting if you do it in an appropriate way. If you say, you know what, I would love to have dinner with your family because you're such a delightful family, but professionally I can't do that, because you need to have some privacy, and so do I. What you're teaching them in a situation like that is that maintaining and setting boundaries is okay, and they can do it too. There may be times when you want to come and visit where it's not appropriate, but you've just taught them is it's okay to say it's not convenient at that time. Can you come at a different time? We've already talked about projective identification and projection. We have to be careful to look at that we don't know just how somebody else feels. They need to tell us how they feel. We can't read other people's minds, and we can't possibly know how somebody else feels. We've got to inquire and make sure and double-check some of our assumptions. It's a really good thing never to make an assumption if we possibly can avoid it. Okay, let's talk about boundary crossings and violations. What's the difference? Boundary crossings are harmless deviation. Okay, so in other words, what we mean is, let's say somebody gives you a small gift under $5, and it would really be hurtful to them, especially when you're at the end of working with them. And it would be very hurtful for them if you didn't take it. Okay, most agencies have policies that a very small gift is okay. That's an example of a boundary crossing. You're not exploiting the family in any way. You're not doing anything that's going to lead to a slippery slope where they're going to feel like, they've got to give you gifts or you're not going to give them service. you have to think about what's the impact going to be. When somebody offers you something, you have to look at what's the likely impact of that going to be on them over the longer term to avoid exploiting them in any way. People will say, is it okay to give a client a hug? If the client has some romantic inclination towards you, absolutely not. If you want to show your support, let's say you're going to a funeral and somebody's parent has died or somebody close to them. It's quite okay to put your hand on their shoulder and offer them support that way without actually hugging them. Okay, so there's a variety of things that you can do. That's a boundary crossing. You're putting your hand on their shoulder, offering them support, but it's not a violation. It's not something that's going to exploit them in some way. A violation is something that's harmful, or it's potentially harmful. You know, where you're gaining something out of it and the person is not going to gain anything out of it. So you have to be careful around that. And sometimes something can seem like something small. I remember a worker who decided to lend a client $20 because she couldn't feed her kids. There's a boundary violation, a significant one. Because where do you draw the line? What happens when next month she comes and asks you for $20 again? At which point are you going to stop giving her $20? And how's she going to feel when you stop giving her anything? So that's a serious boundary violation. You never give clients money. You don't give them goods. You don't give them anything like that. You help them find resources, but you don't provide them. Because if you do, slippery slope. As soon as you do that, then where's it going to stop? When are you going to stop it? Okay. There's a difference between knowledge and practice in the human services. We think we know boundaries and then we get ourselves into trouble. So we have to constantly think about, is what I'm doing, is this for my benefit or is this for the client's benefit? If it's not for their benefit, don't do it. We can be harmed. We can end up with lawsuits. Our agency can end up with lawsuits. But so can the client be harmed, you know, if we cross boundaries. We have to model boundaries for clients to understand them, and we maintain them warmly. As I mentioned before, we don't have to be nasty about it. We don't have to say, no, that's not appropriate. We can say, oh, thank you so much. That's so thoughtful of you, but no, I'm sorry, I can't accept that. There's liability issues involved in boundary transgressions, so be very, very careful. There's also an impact on public perception. If they see boundary professionals engaging in boundary violations, the public is going to think less of the profession. So we have to be careful about that. Okay, if you find yourself getting too enmeshed or feel pressured by a family or you're getting too close, seek supervision. Talk to other people about it. Don't be ashamed of it. It happens all the time. But what we have to do is we have to go to a supervisor and talk with a supervisor about it. And avoid aligning yourself with any particular family member because their issues resonate more with you than others do. You have to be objective and work with the whole family, not just an individual. As soon as you ally too heavily with an individual, what will happen is you'll lose the rest of the family. So be very careful about that. Okay, finally, and most important of all, you have to try to maintain your perspective and realize, you know what, there are going to be times when we can't help everybody. We can try and we need to do our best always to help people, but there's times when no matter what we do, we're not going to be able to help someone. And I always say, you know, we do what we can and the rest is up to the gods. You know, if the gods decide that your help is going to get people to where you'd like to see them go, then that's great. But sometimes that doesn't happen, and we have to realize at times like that. But this is their journey. We can help as much as we can, and we need to help as much as we can. But beyond a certain point, they have to take it the rest of the way. So that's what maintaining perspective is. You don't want to be taking these things home with you so that it's invading your life, because that will make you less able to help over the longer term. You have to be able to leave things at work. There are things that will trouble you, and you'll think life's unfair, and you'll think things shouldn't happen, and it's true, they shouldn't. But for whatever reason, and we don't understand the reasons, sometimes they do. We have to be able to leave those things at work, and we have to have certain kinds of rituals and things that we do to make sure that we leave them at work. because we have our own families and our own lives to attend to as well. So maintaining perspective is maybe one of the most important things that we have to do. Okay, so thank you, everybody. This has been a wonderful journey, and I guess, are we taking any other questions, or are we done at this point? Okay. Somebody sent a question. Let me just see. Is this one, Maria, you've been sharing great points? Is that it? And is this the thing? Oh, thank you. Oh, how nice. Okay. Agencies funded by CIC have limitations in how much we can do. There are limitations with consequences. Also, I find that engaging professionals takes a lot of time and effort. At the end, I often hear, well, if the person is not willing to change, nothing can be done. What are your thoughts? Okay. I think sometimes that's a cop-out. I'll just answer that very quickly. I think if a professional hasn't tried to learn as much as possible about the situation that the client is in and hasn't tried to use all of those resources, then maybe they're copping out a little bit. I hear a lot of times that agencies have caps on services. I'll put my advocacy hat on now for a moment and just tell you that I have seldom found that to be totally true. If a good case can be made, and someone is prepared to go to a funding body to talk with them about it, I think you'll often find that agencies do have some leeway where there's a really good case to be made, and I would encourage professionals to make that case. A perfect example right now is community care access centers. They've topped out a number of hours that they can offer people each month by regulation. That regulation may soon be challenged under the Human Rights Code as discriminating against people who need more assistance. So that may or may not succeed, but it had the desired effect. The CCAC was more flexible in how it decided to provide hours of service. So sometimes I think just asking a simple question like, if I call up the funding body, if I call up the people who fund you, am I going to get the same answer from them as you're giving me right now? Is sometimes all it takes for an agency to become more flexible. So I encourage people to do that. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. It's been great, and hopefully one day I'll meet all of you.
All right. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I thought that was great. About handouts, like I said at the beginning, we're going to be archiving and saving all of this information, the webinar, as well as a PDF version of the PowerPoint, in approximately 1 week. So check out the hongslip.ca website in about 1 week, and you should be able to get all the information from today. So please fill out the survey. It should show up as soon as you turn off the webinar. If it doesn't show up and we have technical difficulties, we will email it to all of you guys. So please fill it out. It'll only take you 1 minute at the most, and it's going to help us out. I'm not sure. Is there any other info that you guys need, or are we good to go? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you so much, Dr. Pindel. This was so great. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.